Hello everybody, this is Hammer Striker here. Today I want to talk about two things that are important to consider when you're buying your first gun, especially if you're buying it for personal defense, whether it's home or concealed carry, that aren't often talked about. So everybody always talks about price, brand recognition, capacity, and all those types of things. They're very commonly talked about, and they're important. Budget matters. But two things that don't get talked about often that I think are actually quite important is the grip and the trigger. And one of the things you'll hear about the grip is, well, you can train through it. Yes, you can, but if you're newer to it, something that fits you well is going to work better than something that doesn't. And as far as triggers, I've got an assortment of different style triggers here. Hammer guns, striker guns, good triggers, not so good triggers. And you'll hear people say, well, a newbie can't get the best out of a really fine trigger, so it kind of doesn't matter. It actually does. Yes, once you're experienced, you can do better with a good trigger. But if you're inexperienced, it's harder to do good with a bad trigger. So I'm going to talk about a few of these things. So I'm going to start with every one of these guns has at least 10 round capacity. So if you're looking for something that is, at least 10 round capacity, they'll all have that kind of capacity in this. And I have safety checked every one of these, but I'm going to show you anyway as I pick them up. This one is one that you might look at, LCP Max. It's got 10 plus rounds capacity, and it's small. Everybody talks about, I want it to be small, I want it to be light. This is by Ruger. And, you're right, it is a good gun. It is small, it is light, you can throw it in a pocket. But look what happens when I close my hand around it, even with the magazine in it. My hand just engulfs it. And then when I put my finger in the trigger, if I don't want to have my finger all the way out here, I have a lot of finger on the trigger. So even though it has overall a decent trigger, kind of a nice, kind of light, a decent trigger, it's going to be hard to shoot this well, because it's important that you fire the trigger with the pad of your finger like this, not the middle of your finger. If you try to do it with the middle of your finger, your hand is going to have a tendency to curve as you pull the trigger. So even though this is a good quality gun, it's light, it's small, and it has a decent trigger, this is actually going to be harder to shoot well for somebody who's just getting into it than something a little bigger, a little heavier, that doesn't require some kind of compromises to hold on to it properly. I'm not saying don't get this, but that's something to consider. Don't just look for capacity, size, and does it have a great trigger. Something like this Glock, this is a Glock 19. This is a common first gun. It's one of those, if you don't know what to get a Glock 19. But is that really the best thing for you? Notice the grip is a little bit bigger. I get a 3-finger grip on it. I don't have my pinky hanging off. Like when I had this, my pinky kind of hung off. So I've got a good grip on it. It'll be easier to control. Notice that the length of pull, the distance from the back to the trigger, is a little bit longer, so I can put the pad of my finger on the trigger without having to curl my finger out like that. So it's going to be fairly easy to keep this gun straight as I'm pulling the trigger, and it has a decent trigger. It's not a hair trigger, you don't want a hair trigger, but it's also not a long, heavy trigger. So this is a striker gun. You're going to find that most striker triggers are similar to this. And one thing that to know about striker triggers is they generally fire once, and then until the gun cycles, they don't fire again. So if it doesn't go off, you have to cycle it. Some others, like some of these hammer guns I'm going to show you, can fire repeatedly, or you can pull the trigger repeatedly and attempt to fire the gun. Now something like this Sky, it's got a decent sized grip, it's got a pinky extender on the magazine, so I'm getting a nice 3-finger grip. It has a decent trigger. This is a CPX2 by Sky. It has a decent trigger. It's a double action trigger. It's a hammer gun, so actually as I'm pulling the trigger, I'm cocking the hammer and then releasing it all in one action. So it's a little heavier than, let's say, that Glock. But notice the trigger fires all the way at the back. If I let it out, I can do it again. I can do it repeatedly. A lot of hammer guns have that ability. But notice that I start here. So this is where I start to put tension on it. And I have to travel all the way back here. And you notice my hand shook a little bit while I was doing that. While I was talking to you. It's a little harder to shoot something like this well with that long, kind of heaviest trigger and have the muzzle of the gun pointed where it was when you start and have it still pointed there and not do this at the end. So something like this is also inexpensive. So the whole budget thing comes in. You might, well, that's cheap. I got a 3-finger grip. I got 10 plus rounds of capacity and a half decent trigger. But if you pull the trigger a few times, kind of watch and see if the gun is turning as you're pulling the trigger. Yes, you can train through it, but maybe if you started with one that didn't do that to you from the beginning, you'd be better from the beginning. Worst case, you buy something that's inexpensive. Maybe take this High Point. These are very inexpensive. They're decent quality. The ergonomics on them are kind of poor. It's got a sculpted grip. It actually kind of looks gripped. Worst case, you buy something like this because it's inexpensive, find out it's just totally unsuitable, and you end up having to buy something else. Well, you kind of wasted your money. So something like this High Point, these are popular because they're cheap and they're reliable. This is a C9. The majority of these guns are 9mm, except this little guy here, which is 380, which are, the common calibers people are going to look at. Now, this particular one has a magazine disconnect, so I have to put the magazine in it. What a magazine disconnect does is the gun won't fire if the magazine's not in it. Kind of a dubious safety feature, but some guns have it. So as I'm holding this thing, the trigger is actually half decent, but it's kind of at a weird angle. So as I push it, it's kind of at a weird angle. But the overall ergonomics of it, it doesn't fit my hand well. So when I pick it up, first thing I need to do is kind of play around with it to get it to sit right in my hand. Well, that's not going to long term, that's not going to be good if you're having to play around with it to get it to sit. Versus me, personally, I pick up a Glock and it's ready to go. It's just right for me. And by the way, Glocks and Springfields, the XDMs, a lot of the other guns out there have the ability to have a backstrap that you can change out or add. In the case of a Glock, you add it. That will change the thickness and contour of the grip to make it fit your hand better. So make sure that, if you've got a gun that's close, something like, say this Glock is close, if it were just a little bit bigger, it'd work. Well, you can get the back straps that come with it. So you check to see if the gun you're looking at comes with the back straps. The other thing to kind of consider is the Glock grip angle is a little different than some other guns. So some people, when they bring a Glock up and they line up the sights, they end up having to do one of these. So whatever gun you pick, whether it's a Glock or any of them, bring it up like you were going to shoot it. And if you have to kind of do this kind of thing with it, and then another one very similar, let's say you picked up an Echelon, Springfield Echelon, or a PPQ, Walther PPQ or PDP, and you didn't have to do that. Well, the one that you can just pick up and line the sights up naturally and not have to play around with it is going to be a better choice for you. So I'm not saying High Point's bad. Maybe a good choice for you, may not. For me, kind of not, because I have to play with the grip. Now, there's other grip styles, like this is a Smith & Wesson M&P Shield Plus. And again, these all have 10 plus rounds of capacity. This one, the grip is nice, it's well contoured, it's well textured, but the shape of it doesn't fit the shape of my hand real well. So when I kind of squeeze down on it, I feel pressure in one spot, I feel pressure here, and no pressure in other places. It's not the best grip configuration for the size of my particular hand. Now, from a trigger perspective, it's got a very nice trigger. It's not a hair trigger, so it is a good safe trigger. It's got a nice short reset. So it's a good choice, it's a good trigger, and it is a good gun. These have been proven to be reliable, but it will depend solely on your hand and how it fits your hand. These don't have replaceable back straps. You pretty much, what you see is what you get, so it either fits you or it doesn't. Now, get into something like this. Now you're getting into a little bit bigger military weapon. These would be something that people would consider for because of the style of it. And this is a Beretta M9A3, which is basically an evolution of the Beretta 92. Seen in a lot of movies. Somebody might recommend this to you because it's cool, and it is. Look at the thing; it just looks cool. A couple features of this: it has two different. This particular version, the M9A3, has this grip that you see here, which is kind of a rubberized grip, and it's a wraparound grip, and it's fairly large. And it also comes in the box with grip panels, which will be smaller and thinner. So this fits my hand well, but let's say you had a smaller hand, you would be able to put the grip panels on it. But when I pick this up and hold it, it just fits right in the hand. So now let's talk about the trigger. This is a DASA, double action, single action. I cocked it by cycling it to show that it was clear. A little bit of take up, very, very short, light, crisp break, very nice trigger. But if it doesn't cycle, or you haven't cycled it and it's the initial trigger, it's got a longer, kind of like that Sky, all the way back, kind of a longer and slightly heavier trigger. Now it's smooth, But the key to this is it's not the same every time. So you have to realize that depending on the state of the gun, whether the hammer is back or not, you're going to have a different trigger. That can have a learning curve with it. Something like this might not be the best first gun, especially for defensive purposes, because you might train all the time with it starting here where it's going to be heavy, and then you actually have it in a combat situation where it's cocked and you got to put your finger on the trigger like you normally would and you just fired. So you have to kind of train through that. You have to realize to be aware of where the trigger is and how it feels before you get too far through it. There's training involved. That may not be a best first choice. Is this thing reliable? These things are dead reliable. They're cool, they're nice looking. The Beretta 92s, they also come in different colors. They come in silver and they come in black. They're not all the FDE. But those are things to consider that go well beyond just price, brand recognition, what your buddy's got, that type of thing. Is pick it up, feel it. One thing I will note, always ask permission before pulling the trigger on a gun. Some gun stores and some private owners, depending on who you're looking at, take offense to that. They get annoyed if you dry fire. It's called dry firing when you operate the trigger with no round in it or no snap cap. So always make sure you ask permission. But if you're looking at a gun and they won't give you permission to pull the trigger and you don't know anything about the trigger, then you may not want to consider that gun. You may want to go someplace where you can actually pull the trigger. Because when you get the thing to the range for the first time and you find out the grip doesn't fit you or you hate the trigger, well, you're kind of stuck with it. Now you're looking at buying another gun and either selling this or throwing it in the safe. So in summary, picking something that has a trigger that works well with you, more importantly, that has a grip, that has a balance, that the angle, that when you bring it up, lines up. For me, I pick up a Glock and I'm home. They're a good choice for me. Something like this is an excellent weapon, but it's just too tiny for my hand. I would carry this only when I absolutely positively had to have the smallest type thing. And since we're looking at your first gun here, you kind of are looking for something that will kind of suit everything. So hopefully that's a little bit helpful to you. Consider these factors in addition to all the other price and everything else that you normally consider. Beyond that, if you like our videos, please give us a thumbs up, share, subscribe, click that bell to be notified if you do. Check us out on Facebook, Instagram, Player, and Rumble, and we'll put links to the full reviews of everything that happened to be on the table. But keep in mind, this isn't the only good guns. They're just ones I found that had different triggers, different grips, that were kind of useful for a video like this. And thank you.